Mark, in the first segment, you were talking about extending the tax cuts that are expiring, and there obviously is a whole host of different provisions, and you suggested that policymakers should sort of go through them item by item and figure out what's good policy, what's bad policy, and try to make the best decisions. But being that it's a political process, sometimes defining good policy and bad policy is a little difficult. I mean, you can look at it from an economist perspective and say, this provision is pro-growth and this one is not. But from a political perspective, it's like this provision has a lot of political, it's either perceived or as good politics or bad policies. The SALT deduction, for example, is one of those. How should policymakers sort of weigh those trade-offs between what's good policy and what's good politics, and how do they make those decisions, or how should they make those decisions?
Well, look, a campaign advisor, I'm sure, would tell them focus on what's good politics, but I work in policy. I think they should focus on what's good policy. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act actually started with a beautiful, brilliant piece of policy called the Better Way Plan. And this Better Way Plan was sort of like a tax reformer's dream. It took the corporate tax and basically replaced it with a business consumption tax. It took the individual code and it did sort of a 1986 style, real clean out, lower the rates, broaden the base. Everything was permanent. Everything was pro-growth. It probably, incomes would be significantly higher today had something like that passed, maybe 3% larger.
I think it was paid for, wasn't it, Mark? Wasn't it
fully paid for, fully revenue neutral, fully permanent. They didn't have all the details filled out because it was still a framework, but the vision was fully permanent, fully paid for, just a beautiful piece of work of art. And then we went through the sausage making process and we ended up with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that still had some good provisions, still had some simplicity, but in other ways, only actually eliminated one tax break. It made the tax code in many ways more complex. This 20% deduction is just a disaster. It was somewhat regressive, extremely costly, and it put us in the position where we have all these expirations. And while it probably did grow the economy marginally, I think probably not even enough to see. And so sometimes when you focus too much on politics and the sausage making, you end up, with something that's not all that's good. So my advice to them would be, let's focus on the policy, get as far as you can down that road. And at the end, if you need to adjust to the politics to get the votes, that's what needs to happen.
So are policymakers able to do that? I mean, we've talked on this show before about the notion of having a commission. And if you look at a lot of tax reform efforts in the past, quite often there would be some commission or study that would make recommendations, and then Congress would vote on those. I mean, is it possible for Congress to set the politics aside and focus on policy, or do you need, quote, outside experts to come in and help guide Congress's decisions? And does that work?
Yeah, so I think it depends how this all plays out from a partisan perspective. If this is a Republican-only venture or a Democratic-only venture, I think actually it's really hard to get the policy right because you have neither one's going to have more than a very narrow majority, which means that any one or two or three people can hold the whole thing up, and they can hold it up for special interest reasons. But if this is sort of a big bipartisan package, where the president and Congress are negotiating a cross party, there's opportunity to lose a lot of people and still have a majority and focus on policy. Either way, you ought to listen to the experts. Either way, you ought to listen to the Joint Committee. Either way, you ought to do what's best. I'm definitely open to there being an outside process for this, but I don't think it's necessary to get it done.